Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending this session on trauma and informed care training. This is Rebecca Minetti, and she grew up in Boise, where she is the second of 7 children. Her parents are both native Idahoans, and they were pastors of a small church while Rebecca was growing up. Her father did prison ministry, and her home was always open for the weary and broken to come for a visit or sometimes even for an extended stay. It was within this context that Rebecca was first exposed to a world that was broken, a world where people were being hurt by other people, whether intentional or not, a world where with victims and people struggling to survive the impact of their life circumstances. Her heart has always been for the most broken and for the most vulnerable. And in college, this led her to a decade of service to the Boys and Girls Club, providing a place for kids from the most difficult circumstances to feel safe and loved and valued. Before trauma informed was a phrase she had ever heard. Before trauma informed was a phrase she had ever heard, Rebecca was entrenched in learning and researching how kids not only survive, but can thrive after experiencing a lifetime of trauma. Rebecca graduated from BSU with a BA in youth development. For the past 13 years, she has been a children's pastor and substitute teacher, daily entrenched in the life of what it means to be a kid in today's world and in the public school system. Rebecca lives in Nampa with her wonderful husband and 2 middle school daughters. They love camping, hiking, and hanging out with a lot of aunts, uncles, and cousins. So with that, it's all yours, Rebecca.
All right, well, good evening. Thanks for having me here. I was telling Kim and Robin that I was a little unsure about this whole thing because I've sat in on webinars, but it never occurred to me how weird it is to be the one on the other end talking to people who you can't see. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you all for an awful lot of grace as you watch this, and I will do my best to communicate well and not rush through as quickly as possible. So with that, I thought we'd start with just a little bit about myself and how I ended up in this place where I'm training and communicating about what it looks like to know about trauma and its impact on kids and how to create a culture, whether it's in your home or a classroom, where kids who've experienced trauma can really thrive and find healing and be loved well. But in order to actually start understanding my journey towards that, we actually have to go back 50 plus years to my mom. I don't know, can you see my cursor? Does that work? This is my mom right here. This is my beautiful mama. She's actually one of 8 kids that grew up here in Idaho. And my mom experienced 2 very traumatic events while she was a teenager. One was that she was sexually abused by an uncle for a number of years and never ever told anybody. In fact, she held on to that information until I was in my early 20s. Even my dad did not know that part of her story. And she started experiencing migraines, debilitating migraines. It really, the way the psychiatrist described it later on was that as our bodies age, we can only hold on to so much. And so all of those memories that she had been holding on to and pressing down and not processing were actually having a huge impact on her physical body. And so I watched my mom go through a healing process of that. Right about the time that the sexual abuse ended for my mom, her older sister, she's one of 8. As you can see, there's only 7 kids in the photo. Her oldest sister got bone cancer, and my mom, her senior year of high school, gave up a full ride scholarship to Stanford University to stay home, care for her younger siblings, and watch her older sister die. The reason I bring that up is because that actually is the beginning of kind of my journey on trauma. You know, some of the things that we know about trauma is neuroscience continues to show us that trauma can actually change our DNA and be passed down from generation to generation. And so, not only in the ways that my mom was a parent to us, that was definitely impacted by her trauma, but also it's very likely that the impact of that trauma was so deep on her that it can be passed on from generation to generation. And I have looked at things in myself and thought, gosh, why am I so fearful of things? Like, I have a deep memory of, I was probably 10 or 11, kind of pre-teenish, just starting to hit puberty. I had a very, very safe home. I don't even think I knew what sexual abuse was. Um, and none of that. Like, I had just always been in this really safe and loving environment. And I remember riding my bike home one day, um, from my grandparents, and it was a fairly busy street. And I was riding my bike home, and a car drove by, and some idiot guy, like, yelled out his window like a woohoo, or something ridiculous like that. It was inappropriate but not damaging to me, and my entire body froze up, and I started pedaling as fast as I could to my house, my heart pounding, my entire body shaking. I sensed this incredible danger. My body reacted as though I was in incredible danger in this situation, and my current life had no context for that whatsoever. So I agree with this neuroscience that trauma can actually impact generation to generation to generation. So there may be things that we see in ourselves and even in our kids and kids in our classrooms that maybe we look at their lives and think, I mean, they haven't experienced any trauma. But if we go back a generation or two, there might be severe trauma that has indeed leaked into their DNA, into the environment, all that kind of stuff. So moving on from that, kind of leads into, there's me. This was a few years ago, but I am one of 7 kids. And the other thing that started me kind of on this journey of being interested in how, we hear and tell our stories in life and how events impact us is, as one of 7 kids, I realized in early adulthood that me and my siblings would all sit around and we'd be talking about a certain memory or a story or something that had happened in our life, and realize that all 7 of us could have been in the exact same room having the exact same experience, and each one of us would tell the story differently, and each one of us would have a different way of describing the impact of that memory in our lives. And I remember being, young, early 20s, thinking, well, that's so weird. Like, isn't there just this black and white? This is what really happened. This isn't what really happened. And realizing that the lens through which each one of us saw it, is meaningful. And so to discount, I mean, there was one particular situation that me and my brother were talking about. And for me, it was like this really loving, grounding memory in my life. But for him, who was struggling with some other things in life and where he was at developmentally, it was a really damaging thing in his life. Um, so that, along with like learning my mom's story, all this was kind of happening in my early 20s, that I was hearing my mom's story for the first time. And my siblings were old enough that we were starting to talk about these events that had gone on in our lives and how they'd impacted us all differently. And then it got me thinking, like, okay, how did my mom's story and my dad's story play into their parenting and play into who we are as people? um, which lends to, a really big family. My mom, being one of 8, and us kids, like, there's a lot of cousins. This is less than half of my cousins. Um, and so it makes me think, like, gosh, these journeys that our parents have been on and that we've been on, that's a lot of memories, a lot of stories, a lot of experiences, some big traumas, some small traumas that are being passed down from generation to generation. And as we're learning more, are we doing a better job of healing from those situations, of processing those experiences well, so that the next generation has a better chance at thriving than we have. So that kind of really started my interest in all of this. Like I said in my bio, long before trauma informed was a word that I had ever heard or had any, yeah, I just had never heard that word before. I was already thinking through a lot of, like, gosh, how do our experiences, what kind of voice do our experiences have within our story and how successful we are in life? About this same time, about this same time, I was in college to become an elementary education I always wanted to be a second grade teacher. It's the only thing I ever decided that I was going to do with my life. And I was in my junior year, and we were supposed to be doing some volunteer work. And simply because I saw a commercial, because the Boys and Girls Club in Garden City had just opened up, there was a commercial about it, and I thought, oh, I like kids. Like, that sounds good. It works with my school schedule. And I walked through those doors and I completely fell in love with those kids. And these were the kids that were from the hardest stories I had ever heard. It was built in the middle of Garden City back when Garden City was filled with gangs and drugs, alcohol abuse, poverty. So these were the kids whose stories were the most difficult to hear. And I do remember my entire first year working there. I started out part time there while I was going to school. I think I went home and cried every single night. The stories were just so hard to hear and so hard to hold. And yet, I found so much hope in this organization that was basically saying, yeah, but if we create one environment for these kids' lives that is safe and caring and positive, they have a chance to make it in life. And they have been following that philosophy for 250 years. And so when I'm looking at this current research and research that has only come out in these last few decades about child development and trauma informed care and what it means to help a child survive trauma and thrive in life given hard circumstances, I do go back to this experience I had and thought, man, they got it right. They really got it right from the beginning in terms of what they understand about kids and what kids need to survive tough situations. So that's something I will refer to back just because it was a huge part of my learning. And again, before I even really understood the word trauma, it was a huge piece of me understanding kids who are struggling the most, kids that feel like they matter the least. What is it that they need to survive? What is it that they need to thrive? And so we'll talk about that kind of more as we go on and it'll come up. But that really, all of those pieces together are a huge part of how I've been on this journey of investigating what trauma does and what trauma does to the brain. That kind of leads me to my family today. This is my husband and my two kids. I have an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. So yeah, two middle schoolers. And yes, it is that dramatic at my house all of the time. In fact, one day there was a lot of feelings going on, and my husband, my poor husband, he just goes, there's too many feelings in this room. I'm going to go into a different room. So he just turned around and walked out. He said, I just couldn't handle it. But I've thought a lot about my mom's story and its impact on me, and how is that potentially impacting my girls, and am I paying attention to that? Um, there's trauma on my husband's side of the family as well. How is that impacting how we parent? When I see things in my kids, um, I don't always just think like, oh yeah, she's so me, or she's so like my husband. I oftentimes think through it through the lens of the trauma that both he and I have experienced in life. Oh man, like I can see how, because one of us lives on the defensive sometimes because of an experience, we see that in our kids. Okay, how can we help our kids take it out of the context, right? They don't have a context for living like that. They just are, because there's something written in their DNA from us. And so how can we help our kids heal from that so it doesn't get passed on to the next generation? And we will talk about more that as we go. So that's kind of how I ended up here. Like I said, my degree, I was right before my student teaching, I was offered a full-time position as a program director at the Boys and Girls Club. And by then I had just fallen so in love with the program. I loved the idea of really entering into a kid's heart and life. And loving them from a different angle, I guess, than as a school teacher. And so I ended up going back and getting a degree in youth development, specifically focused on the development of elementary age kids. So that's really where a lot of my formal training has been. I've done some Empowered to Connect stuff. I've read, I don't know how many books on these subjects, but it's just something that's very near and dear to me for lots of reasons. So here we go. Now that you're exhausted already, let's go ahead and get started as I'm flipping through my notes here. So I just want to do, we've got 2 weeks together, 2 sessions together. So I kind of wanted to let you know what the plan is for tonight. So kind of our objectives for tonight is we're going to talk about what is trauma and how does it impact the brain and development. We're going to answer the question like, what is trauma informed care? It's a phrase that is being spoken a lot these days, but what exactly is that? And then we're going to specifically look at some of the work done by Dr. Karen Purvis through TCU. Um, their, their, um, their Institute for Child Development is one of the top in the world in terms of its research and understanding of kids and trauma. And a main um, a main focus of theirs to find healing for kids is through TBRI, which is trust-based relational intervention, and we will talk a lot about that. So those are kind of the objectives for tonight. That means that the next time we are together again, then we'll take these things that we know and we'll talk about how do we practically turn that into a culture that allows kids the space that they need to be loved and to find healing and to find hope, and to thrive. What does that actually mean in practical terms? What I really love about all of this stuff is that it doesn't matter if you're working with a child who has experienced tremendous, prolonged, like big T trauma in their life, or the trauma of COVID, right? All of these strategies we're going to talk about, all of these things that we talk about that are really practical, um, apply to all human beings in every single situation. And so that's what's exciting to me, is that people respond to love and care and attachment and all of those kinds of things. So we'll talk about that as we go along. So that's kind of our plan for tonight. So here we go. So what is trauma? The official definition of trauma is that it's a psychological and emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. And I'll go ahead and say that again. Like the official definition that you can look up as well is it's a psychological, emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. Um, there's really, I think we'll look at what's next. Other terminology that you'll hear that's a really good wrap up for it is ACEs, standing for adverse childhood experiences. When we're talking about trauma for kids, you'll hear the term ACEs a lot. And that just means that they're childhood experiences that are not positive, that have done damage in one way or another to the child. There's really kind of 3 aspects to trauma, and I'm sorry, I should have done another slide since all we're doing is kind of seeing slides, but there's really 3 aspects to trauma. One is the event itself, one is the experience, which is very different from the event, kind of like I was sharing with my siblings, how we could be a part of the same event and have 7 completely different experiences of that event. So you've got the event itself, you've got how the event was experienced, and you've got the effects of that experience. So I'm going to give you a quick example here. And I hope this isn't triggering to anybody, but I'm going to give you an example here. This is, was a few years back. This was my husband's truck. The kids were going into kindergarten and going into preschool, and we had been camping, and we had taken 2 vehicles. So we were driving home from a weekend of camping. My husband was driving this truck, and in it was my brother and my oldest daughter, who was 5 at the time, were in this truck, and he was pulling our tent trailer. I was following behind him in our other car with my sister-in-law and our other daughter, who was 4 at the time. And so we're driving home, and the shoulder of the road is very, very narrow, and it's really gravelly. And the back corner of the tent trailer caught the gravel on the shoulder of the road, and my husband could not regain control, basically. And so they rolled into, thankfully, we were between 2 canyons. They rolled into a field. The truck rolled 7 times. The amazing thing is that everybody walked out okay. My husband hurt his hand a little bit. My brother-in-law had a few scrapes. My daughter simply wasn't touched at all. So there's this whole kind of miracle story around this actual thing. But the point that I want to share with you this is that there's this one event, right? There's this car accident that happens, and yet there's really six different experiences going on. There's the experience that my husband has being the driver of the truck that's lost control. There's the experience of my brother-in-law who had been asleep next to my husband, and all of a sudden everything's crazy and he's trying to reorient himself. And there's the experience of my 5-year-old who's in the back of this truck who had just been watching a movie. And then there's my experience of this event driving the car behind them, watching this entire event take place. There's the experience of my sister in law, who is brand new to the family, watching me freak out, watching her brand new husband rolling. And then there's the experience of our younger daughter who was in the car with me. And to this day, that's some of the trauma that we are dealing with in our lives with our girls. My oldest daughter, interestingly enough, um, is the one who was probably the least traumatized for the whole event, which is just crazy to me because she was the one in this truck that was rolling. Um, and yet something in her personality, in her DNA, in however she experienced that, like she really was the one that was probably the least traumatized in this. um, I had a ton of kind of some kind of PTSD after that. Anytime my husband was driving on a road with the kids for a couple years and I wasn't there, like I would envision them rolling around. So I had to wrestle through like how that experience impacted me. My youngest daughter was 4. To this day, I'm still not quite sure what she heard or what she saw. I know I was screaming, "My whole family's dead! My whole family's dead! I don't know what to do." So I don't know what she heard. I don't know what she saw. I don't know exactly how that experience worked out for her. I see a lot of fear in our youngest daughter. Whenever my husband is traveling alone, she's always worried that he's not going to come home. She just lives with a lot of fear, and I believe that a good portion of it stemmed from this event. So just to give an example of something that like really at the end of the day was this beautiful story of we were protected and nobody died and it was this incredible miracle, and yet this event was experienced six completely different ways, and the effects of that event on all of us involved was really really different, and has needed to find healing in six different ways as well. So I wanted to give you that just kind of as an example, um, of how trauma can show up in our lives and how we can be impacted by it differently. So here we go. So what research tells us is there's really six risk factors to trauma. And so you'll often see this as this is part of like the ACEs. So if you're in a classroom setting and you're learning things about a kid's story, they say like, oh, what is this statistic? I don't want to get it wrong, but it's a really high percentage. It's like 70 to 80% of the population have two or more ACEs. So two or more adverse childhood experiences to deal with. And these are some of the risk factors that lead to those. So one of them is a difficult pregnancy. I remember the first time I heard this and I thought, well, that's, what do you mean? You know, like how can that be trauma? And yet we know from science too that, you know, stress levels in a pregnant mother can have a huge impact on the fetus. So if you're having a difficult pregnancy, a ton of anxiety in the pregnancy, if you're in an abusive relationship during the pregnancy, all of those things have the potential, right? None of these are definitive. All of those things can have the potential for causing trauma to the baby. Another one is a difficult birth. And again, I want to be really clear that this isn't like a definitive, yeah, I had a difficult birth, so my kid has been traumatized, right? Because we all experience events differently. Again, my oldest daughter, who's my even keel, super healthy child, had a really, really difficult birth. My younger daughter, who really has dealt with some trauma and some other things, had a super easy birth. So these aren't definitive. These are just risk factors to be looked at when you're trying to decide, like, gosh, is what I'm seeing behavior wise for my child, is that an impact from trauma? So difficult birth can be one. Even, sometimes what happens is an emergency cesarean can be incredibly traumatic for the mom and the child because you don't get the skin to skin contact right away sometimes. Or if something happens in the birth and the child gets taken away from the parents right away because they are having trouble breathing, or whatever it is, so they miss that initial skin to skin contact, things like that, that can be a risk factor. Another one is early hospitalization. And again, just that idea of the separation that happens when attachment is the most ideal, right? We know that those first 18 months, attachment, good, healthy attachment, to a mother, to a grown up, is really important to the development of a child. And so, what early hospitalization can do is it can interrupt that process of healthy attachment. Another risk factor is abuse, obviously, right? Any sort of abuse can be a risk factor: mental, emotional, physical, sexual abuse. Neglect, not getting their needs met, right? That's what neglect is: not being loved well, not being having their physical needs met. Those are definitely high risk factors. And another one is just all sorts of trauma, right? And it can be anything from divorce to domestic violence to bullying, crime, natural disasters. I mean, think about the type of trauma that kids have experienced who've had to evacuate from national disasters, lost their homes and their communities, what they saw. Economic stress in the home can absolutely be a risk factor for trauma to the brain. Job loss of a parent, because it can create so much stress in the home. It can lead to problems in marriages that kids are seeing and privy to. That can be a risk factor. Sickness of a loved one, a pandemic, right? I think at this point it's probably safe to say that all of us have experienced some level of trauma from this pandemic. And that's just a real reality. It's impacted people in different ways. Again, the same event, but having different sorts of experiences and being really aware of that is important. In fact, I was reading something, the other day that talked about, let me see if I can find it in my notes. I thought I wrote it down. Or maybe it's on another page, guys. What is that? Nope, I'll find it later. But basically talking about how, when we're going to talk about felt safety, and how felt safety is one of the top priorities in helping kids overcome what COVID has done to their world in the last year. Well, we're moving on to 2 years now, right? And let's not forget that a learning disability can absolutely be trauma to a kid. Oftentimes, kids who have learning disabilities, it can take a long time to diagnose, it can take a long time to find. And when you're parenting a young child that has a learning disability, you don't know how to parent them well, because it's different than maybe with another child, or what they're expecting from a different sort of development. And so, oftentimes, kids with a learning disability don't experience attachment the same way. They don't experience connection the same way. Their parents may not know what to do. And so we tend to kind of separate instead of draw close. And that can have an impact on the development of the brain with trauma as well. So, as you can see, if a huge portion, it makes sense to say that most of us have at least two of these risk factors in our lives. So it's fair to say that all of us have experienced some sort of trauma in our life. The thing about trauma is it doesn't discriminate. It affects the wealthy and the poor. It affects any gender, any race, families that seem to have it all together, and those that seem to be barely hanging on. The truth is, we just live in a broken world filled with broken people, and that impacts all of us in lots of different ways. So I have a video here that kind of gives a little more information on ACEs. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this, and it should pop up for you.
A child's experiences early in life are important building blocks for the developing brain. Genes, nature, are like the blueprint. They provide the basic framework for brain development. However, genes do not design the brain completely. Environmental influences, nurture, fine-tune how the brain works by shaping which brain connections get used. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent, whereas ones that do not get much use fade away. Together, genes and the environment build the foundation for all future development. Safe, stable, and nurturing relationships early in life lead to healthy development. But children's brains capture other experiences as well, stressful events. However, not all stress is bad. Positive stress involves normal childhood experiences, like starting daycare or meeting a new person for the first time. This stress is essential for healthy development because it helps children develop coping skills and confidence. But when stress is frequent, chronic, and uncontrolled, it is toxic to children, especially when they do not have a caregiver to provide support or buffer the stress. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, such as abuse, neglect, exposure to intimate partner violence, parental depression or addiction, and poverty, are toxic stressors which could lead to lifelong changes in learning and behavior. ACEs early in development can impact social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, increased risk taking behavior such as drinking and substance use, and increased risk of disease, disability, and social problems later in life. The question is, how do adverse childhood experiences impact a lifelong development? One of the most important systems in our body is our stress system. It's activated when we experience stress. We become alert, our heart rate increases, and so do our stress hormone levels, cortisol and adrenaline. Our body is ready to react, what is known as fight or flight. A short period of time after the stress is over, or if a child receives support from a caregiver, the stress response turns off and the body returns to a normal state. Adverse childhood experiences create stress responses that stay active, and without the support of a caregiver, the system has difficulty shutting off completely. This constant and prolonged activation can affect immune system functioning and increase the chances of sickness, infection, and disease. Prolonged activation of stress hormones is also toxic to the brain. Certain areas of the brain are more vulnerable to toxic stress, including the executive center or the brain's control center, an area important for solving complex problems, attention, reasoning, impulsivity, inhibition, and learning. A second area is the emotional center, the brain's alarm system, which is involved in processing and interpreting emotions and the ability to control impulses. The third area is the memory and learning center, the brain's filing cabinet, which plays a major role in learning and the formation and retrieval of memories. Science shows that adverse childhood experiences impact all of these brain centers. Behaviorally, what we begin to see is emotional distress, poor emotion regulation, greater impulsivity, learning difficulties, and physical and mental health problems. More recently, science has begun to look at how ACEs cause changes in gene expression through a process called epigenetics, which helps us understand how nature and nurture interact. Epigenetics causes changes in the way genes work without changing the DNA code itself. This occurs through chemical changes influencing how the code is used. In other words, genes are like the hardware in a computer. They determine the boundaries of what is possible. However, we need an operating system to tell the hardware what to do. Epigenetics is like the operating system directing the function of a gene's DNA hardware. The genes we are born with are the genes that we have for life, but experiences like nutrition, exercise, smoking, stressors, and relationships all affect our biology. Adverse childhood experiences are associated with epigenetic changes related to stress, brain development, cognition, and systems associated with mental and physical health. Changes that happen early in brain development are more likely to be enduring and are possibly passed on to future generations as well.
Sorry, I know that's a, a brief cutoff, but there's more to that video. Yeah, so that kind of gives an idea of, how do I get back to? There we go. Of what ACEs can do in the long term, like how they impact a child's development, especially when they're younger and their brains are developing. And you can see that kind of that idea of the epigenetics again, like why, if I had never had any sort of dangerous experience or unsafe experience with a man, why, as I was growing up and through my 20s, did I always feel a sense of danger if I was, on a street and there were strange men around? Or why in the world would I have any of those feelings at all? Because it was not part of my environment growing up. But looking back at my mom's story of abuse, I can see the epigenetics at work in my own life, that I would feel that fear and that stress, even though I didn't have my own personal context for it. So I think that's a really great video just to give an idea on how ACEs impact. And I was gonna, so Kim, can everybody see, like, I know I can see me. Can anybody else see me in person, or should I turn off screen share for a second? They can see me. Okay, so one thing I want to show you, and some of you may have seen this before, and actually I'm seeing it taught more and more in classrooms to kids, which I think is super duper awesome. But if you've never seen like the hand model of the brain, I don't know if you've ever seen that or not, so I'll just show you real quick because it's a really useful visual. And as we kind of talk more, especially next time, about what are some practical things that we can do to create a safe environment for kids that have experienced trauma, by understanding kind of how the brain works and what trauma does to the brain is super important. So if my hand is the brain, right, and my wrist here is the brain stem, so you've got all these nerves that are communicating things to my body from my brain. And then my thumb right here is my amygdala. And your amygdala is like, that's your primitive brain, right? It's your fight, flight, or freeze. It doesn't have the ability to reason or learn or anything like that. This is purely your survival mechanism of your brain. And then if I fold my fingers over the top, that is my prefrontal cortex, right? So that's that part of the brain that can reason, that can learn, that can manage my emotions, all of those things that are necessary for me to develop into a mature and thriving and productive citizen. What happens when there's trauma, or what happens, like the video talked about those stress hormones racing through you. So this can happen like, you smell smoke and think there's a fire, or you put on your brakes really fast because a car is coming towards you that isn't paying attention, whatever it is. What happens is literally the term, like, you flip your lid shows up. So your brain just like flips and you immediately go into this fight, flight, or freeze. You lose all of your ability. When you're in survival mode, you lose your ability to reason, to manage your emotions, to learn new things. And so, what can happen in prolonged trauma, or trauma that's just incredibly severe? Remember, there's events and there's how we experience events, and there's no really, I don't think there's necessarily even like a rhyme or reason to how like you can experience something differently than me, right? It has all sorts of factors involved with that. But what can happen over a long period of time or with a certain event based on genetics and environment and all that kind of stuff is that your brain doesn't recover. You can get absolutely stuck in a flipped lid. And if a child is stuck in a flipped lid, they're not in any sort of position to be able to learn, to reason, to manage their emotions. They simply don't even have the capabilities to do that. So we'll talk about next time what it looks like to help re-flip the lid, and what are some tools that we can use, what are some things that can be helpful to train a child to do that. But I love this image of like, is your lid flipped, and what do you need to do to pull it back down so that you can continue to learn, so that you can heal. Something else that science has shown too is, and I promise I'll look it back up so that because I've forgotten, is there's a piece in our brain that is basically a pathway between the right and the left hemisphere of the brain. And what can happen with prolonged trauma is that it actually will kind of stop because you're stuck in this. What will happen is that pathway becomes smaller and becomes narrower. And so your brain does not have the capability to process new information well. You can actually just, that's part of that, how you're just like stuck in fight, flight, or freeze, which I think is really fascinating. So that the image in the video about a filing cabinet is a great image for that, that when an event happens in our life, when we're healthy, right, and when we can reason, we can learn, we can manage our emotions, all of that kind of stuff, when we're in that good healthy space and all of our brain is working correctly, we can take the experience and we can process it the right way. And it's like, oh, it's like you've got this pile of papers on your desk, and you either like you can put them away in a file cabinet so that you have access to them again when you need them, but they're not just like out in front of you all the time. So if I leave a bunch of piles on my desk, whenever I want to get to something else, I have to see that pile of papers. I have to deal with that pile of papers. I have to move around that pile of papers to get to what I have to do. And the same thing can happen with those experiences in our lives. If we don't have the ability to file them away so that, again, we still have access to those memories, we still have access to those experiences, but they're not still impacting our everyday life. They're not still impacting how we see the world. They're not the lens through which we see our lives anymore. And so I think that that's super interesting, that those things can actually change. They can change our brain. They can, those negative experiences, those ACEs can actually change the development of our brain. The good news is, and here's what's so great, the good news is that our brains can continually be rewired. They can be rewired so that if that thing is closed up, it can be reopened up. If we're stuck, or if a child is stuck in this fight, flight, or freeze, it's possible to rewire and get you back into a healthy place and to grow out of that. And that it's never too late. And I love that. There's so much hope in that. It doesn't matter if you're 3 or you're 13 or you're 43, whatever it is, like our brains continually grow. They continue to be rewired. They can continue to heal all of the time. And so I find that really, really hopeful. So as we talk through this, I hope that you yeah, I hope that you feel that sense of like, man, this is discouraging. It feels like everything is just breaking us more. All these life experiences are always breaking us, but we can heal from them when we find the right tools, when we can create the right environments. And thankfully, our world right now has more information and more understanding of the brain than we ever have. And there are so many incredible tools out there that can help kids and help grown-ups heal from these traumatic experiences that are just part of living in this world that we live in. So with that, let's take a little bit of time to look at trauma-informed care. And there are really kind of 3 pillars to trauma-informed care. One of them is felt safety. Another one is connection, and a third one is self-regulation. And my understanding, as I've talked to teachers and stuff, is regulation is a term that gets used a lot, which is basically like, can I manage my emotions? Can I understand my emotions and my needs? And can I figure out a way to get those needs met? So we're going to talk through these a little bit. The first one is felt safety. And felt safety is really 3 things. And I love the term felt safety, because I can say to my daughter, why are you freaking out? You're safe, right? I can say that because I understand the environment. She may not feel that way based on just where she's at emotionally that day, based on past trauma, whatever it is. So it's one thing to say to a child, I know your environment's safe. Why are you freaking out? But their reality is whether or not they feel safe. So how can we create an environment where kids have felt safety? So felt safety means that the child knows that they're seen, knows that they're heard, and knows that they're valued. Those are 3 real pillars of felt safety. Yeah, this was that quote I was looking for. It was in an article I read through TCU. That felt safety in the classroom needs to be the foundation of everything else we do and build in order for kids to become resilient and heal from the impact of COVID-19. I think something that we've seen over and over again, this impact of COVID-19, is it's just such an, what's the word? Everybody's lives are just constantly being disheveled, right? Like what I knew isn't what I know, and this is changing, and this is changing, and this is changing, and this is changing, and there hasn't been a whole lot of stability to how we live our lives, how we approach relationships. Do I go to the store with a mask or not a mask? And maybe one time I do, and maybe one time I don't. And what does all this mean? And so whatever we can do, and I mean this is directed towards teachers in a classroom, but even, you know, in my own home as a parent, how can I make sure that my kids feel seen, heard, and valued? The next pillar of trauma-informed care is connection. And connection actually changes brain chemistry. I love that. We are human beings created to connect to one another. We are social beings. We do not survive isolated. And it's within connection, within relationship, that we find healing. And it's within relationship that our brain chemistry can actually change. There's a book that came out this last year called Thrivers by Michelle Borba. It's called Thrivers: The Surprising Reasons Why Some Kids Struggle and Others Shine. And in that book, she tells about a study done by Emmy Warner, who's a psychologist at the University of California. This Werner did a 4-decade investigation of hundreds of children living on the Hawaiian island of Kauai. And nearly a third of them were born into poverty or faced problems like parental mental illness, substance abuse, etc., basically trauma. And she discovered that the kids that defied and overcame their odds in spite of hardships all had one thing in common. They had a strong bond with at least one supportive adult. And other leading psychologists that have studied children who've experienced homelessness, abuse, war, terrorism, and poverty have also discovered the same common factor. So kind of going back to when I was working with the Boys and Girls Club, that was really a key tenet to their success, is that every child has one adult, one loving, caring adult that they connect to, that they feel safe with. And so we're watching research continue to show that over and over again, which is, if you're a classroom teacher or you're somebody working in an after school program, and I remember oftentimes feeling this hopelessness of like, what does it even matter that I do? Because how can my small amount of presence in this child's life have an impact that can override what they're experiencing at home or in their neighborhood or whatever it is? Feeling really defeated by that. I was at the Boys and Girls Club for 10 years, and I love this story, not because it really says that much about me, other than the fact that I was faithful to show up day after day after day. But there was a family there that was there the first couple of years I was there. They had 5 kids, tons of trauma. Both parents were drug addicts and alcoholics. They often, you know, got divorced and then got remarried. The kids lived in a homeless shelter in town for a long time. Just really had everything against them except the club. And for 5 hours every day, 5 days a week, we were able to make sure that the kids were safe and fed and loved by us. And I was only a couple years in, and the family moved away, and I really didn't hear from them again until just a couple years ago. Um, the youngest boy, who had been only like 7 when they moved away, found me on Facebook, and he told me that you know, they had moved around a lot. They lived in like 4 different states after living here. They've been in and out of foster care, all sorts of things. So not, you know, really transient, and parents really transient. And he said that his mom had saved one box of things in all of their moves, all of their stuff. And within that box was this thing, this little booklet that, if I'm really honest, I didn't have any memory of creating or giving to them at all. But I had made it for the kids, and I had printed out pictures of their time at the club and with other staff and that kind of stuff. And I'd written a little note to each one of the kids telling them what I saw in them and how much I loved them, and just trying to encourage them, you know, whatever. It was pretty brief and small. But this boy who was 7 at the time, again, I have not seen him, and he's, I don't know how, he's almost 30 now. Um, he wrote to me. He said, my mom found this in a box, and she said that it was just something that she always thought was worth saving no matter where we went. And he said to me, he said, you are a cornerstone of greatness in my life, and when I was little, you were a huge part of my happy place. When all around my family was darkness, you and the Boys and Girls Club shined through for us to have some peace. And I don't say that because of me. Like I said, all I did was faithfully show up. That's all I did. I didn't have any sort of like magic formula. I didn't even have all the knowledge. I mean, I was like 22. I didn't have even all the knowledge that I have today about like how to create an environment for kids, or, I didn't have those tools, but I faithfully showed up. And the studies continue to show that, what those kids needed all those years later was we had a place for a little while in our life where we knew we were safe, we knew we were loved. And today, this young man has been married for 10 years. He has 3 kids that he's raising so well. He's had the same stable job, no drugs or alcohol. And he said, I just was able to have, because of that one safe place and that safe relationship, I was able to have an imagination for a different sort of reality for my life. So when I was old enough and I had the opportunity to live my life differently, I had some sort of imagination for what that could be. And I wanted to find that. So connection is so, so important. And that will mean even more when we get to TBRI. So same thing. It only takes one healthy relationship to help a child build resilience. I love that. Again, that's hope, right? And maybe it's for a short period of time. And that's our job as educators and parents and people who love the kids in our communities is I can show up today. Like I can show up and I can love you to the best of my ability today. I can give you all the resources I have available today. And I don't know, I don't know what is going to happen with that, but I can be faithful to what has been placed in my care at this moment. And then the third kind of tenet to trauma informed care is regulation, that unflipping of the lid. How do you do that? So there's kind of like 3 levels to that. One is to really start with external regulation. And external regulation is when a grown-up actually does the regulating for the child. So, for example, when an infant is crying, we don't hold the infant out like this, right? When an infant is crying, we cradle them. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, but we typically, whether you're right-handed or left-handed, we typically tend to cradle a baby with their head on the same side as our heart. And we hold the baby close and we, kind of rock or shush or whatever it is. But what the external regulation does is it says to that infant, match your heartbeat to mine. You're feeling distress right now. I'm going to hold you close to my heart, and my heartbeat will actually mirror yours. And that's how a baby's heartbeat can slow down and they can find peace, and that need is met so that they're no longer in distress. That's an example of external regulation. Like I am going to regulate for you using my own body. I do that with my daughter now and have for years when she just gets really anxious or really scared or just has too much energy and can't slow down. Studies show that like 30 seconds of like a good kind of tight hold, right? 30 seconds of that kind of pressure actually slows down the heartbeat, and what's the word, guys? See, this is why I need a live audience. Somebody give me the word. It decreases the level of that stress hormone cortisol racing through our body. And so I will still hold my daughter close to me and still use my heartbeat to regulate hers. I will use my calmness to give her calmness. That's external regulation. And if a child is in that place where they don't know how to regulate themselves, this is where you start with is external regulation. And then co-regulation is the idea that we help a child meet their needs, right? So in external regulation, the child probably doesn't know what they need or know how to communicate that need at all, right? So we're using ourselves to just help meet that need that we see in them. Co-regulation is when we're just helping the child meet their needs. So an example of co-regulation would be you say to the child, you know what, it looks like you might need a drink of water. How about I get it for you and I'll sit here with you while you drink it? Because the child does not have the ability to say, I'm thirsty, and to go get the water themselves and to even drink it by themselves, right? Either because their lid is flipped or they're already stuck in that place, whatever it is. And so that co-regulation says, it looks like you might be thirsty. How about I'll get some water for you and I'll sit here next to you while you drink it. And so you're teaching them what regulation looks like. You're not just throwing them out saying, hey, you figured out you need a drink of water, go get a drink of water. So this idea of co-regulation. Then finally, right, the goal is self-regulation, that I know how to manage my own emotions, I know how to communicate my own needs, I know how to advocate for myself, I know how to get my needs met, right? So self-regulation means that they can do it in a healthy way, and we'll talk about this next time too, when we're talking about behaviors and misbehaviors and stuff. So that idea that they know how to get their needs met in a healthy way. So, an example of that would be, hey, the child shows up to school with their water bottle. And when their water bottle's all gone, they know to raise their hand or wait for the appropriate time to say, can I refill my water bottle? And they do it by themselves, and they sit back at their desk and they remember to sip on it all day long. So that's, an example of self-regulation. The child knows what they need. They're able to communicate it and get it met in a really healthy way.
So Rebecca, on that idea, because I know I'm an educational therapist, so I work with children one-on-one, and then the classroom, the teachers, I remember with my daughter having asthma and having an asthma attack during a race. She was in cross country, and walking next to her and getting her to breathe with me, because it wasn't her asthma, it was an anxiety attack, got her down. But how do we do that in a classroom where we're really not supposed to hug them, which is really what they need? Do you have any ideas to help with that external until we can get to that to the self?
Yeah. There's some, honestly, with that kind of stuff too, if you've got a child with an EAP, or what is that, or like a 504 or whatever, it might be something that you can create within that, to just say, like, there might be times that the child needs some physical contact. Is it okay as a teacher if I give that? In working with the parents, it might be something, it probably depends on the district and all that kind of stuff too, but I think that's always worth, like, definitely asking. But that's why there's a lot of stuff out there that I've seen. There are things that are like almost like these Lycra bands, or type of thing that you can put around you, or weighted vests. I've seen classrooms that teachers will have like a weighted kind of lap pad, that will just create, it does that same thing of like creating that sense of weight on a child. My niece is autistic, and she had a weighted vest that she kept at school with her for a long time. And part of her learning self-regulation started with the teacher saying, it feels like you're a little bit anxious or having trouble communicating or whatever it is. Why don't we get your weighted vest and wear it for 5 minutes or whatever it was? And the idea to get to that self-regulation was for my niece to be able to communicate, hey, can I put on my weighted vest for a few minutes? Or, that they have ones that almost look like a little heating pad type of thing, so they can put it on their lap, they can rest it across their shoulders, wherever that kind of pressure or weight feels good. That can sometimes accomplish that same thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes I've noticed with kids in the classroom too, one of the greatest classroom management skills I have too is just the same idea of just the power of your presence next to them. And so if I have a kid that's really struggling in class, they won't sit down, they're not being respectful, they won't engage in the work, whatever it is. Sometimes all it takes is me moving and standing really close to them. And I'll continue to teach, I'll continue to talk. I won't even break what I'm doing at all. I'll just stand in very close proximity to that child. Sometimes I might even put my hand on their back or just on their shoulder while I'm talking. And even that can be enough to help a kid kind of regulate themselves. Like, okay, I'm seen, right? I'm being seen. I'm being noticed here. She can see that I'm having a hard time. And instead of sending me off to the corner or punishing me or yelling at me in front of the class, like, she's actually drawing close to me instead of separating me. And oftentimes that's my greatest classroom management tool as a whole as well. I was in a 7th grade class. So I'm a true glutton for punishment for substitute teaching in a middle school. But I had a kid that was just, in any other situation, I think somebody who just didn't have some of this information might have sent him to the principal's office, might have done whatever, because he was just being mouthy. And then I was sitting there thinking, okay, so what is it that this guy needs? What does he need in this situation? And I don't know anything about him. I don't know anything about his story. But is it possible that in his world and from his story, to have a substitute teacher, a stranger walk in the door, could really trigger some anxiety in him, some fear in him, some sort of unsettlement in him? And so he acts out, right? Because he has this need of like, I don't know if I matter to you. I don't know if I matter to you. I don't know if I'm important to you. I don't know if I'm valuable to you. And so I just continued to teach the class. And this kid that had been mouthing off, I just stood next to him the whole time I taught. So I taught from the back of the class, and he just like settled right in and figured out the rest of the class period together. And so a lot of times these things are just like some sort of, physical touch or presence next to somebody. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So we can help in a lot of ways just by that. Again, going back to that connection, really, we heal through relationships, and um, yeah, it's one of the best ways that we survive is through relationships. Okay, I want to get through this TBRI stuff before we have to go tonight. So TBRI comes out of, and a lot of this first stuff really actually comes out of research done by Dr. Karen Purvis through um, TCU, Texas Christian University. Their Institute of Child Development is world renowned. They do a ton of work with kids that have experienced severe trauma. They do a lot of training and work with children in foster care and children in orphanages around the world. And what I have found, just even in my own life and working with kids that, just are pretty average, like my own children that have experienced some stuff, but in general are really loved and have a stable home, that these strategies and this philosophy works across the board. And that's what I love so much about it. It's this idea that we become broken through relationship, but that also means that we find healing through relationship. So this is called TBRI, or trust-based relationship. And I'm going to have you watch this little video here. The voice is actually Dr. Karen Purvis. She passed away a few years ago. This video can be found on YouTube, so feel free to watch it again if you want to take notes or anything later on.
TBRI, trust-based relational intervention, has at its core building a trusting relationship. It has 3 sets of principles, and they look at the child as a whole. When you think about development, the baby cries, and I say, yes, I will comfort you. And so this child learns that they have a voice. They learn trust, which is the lesson of the first year of life. I can trust. There are so many children from hard places. And for those children, their capacity to trust has been fiercely damaged. The brain chemistry of a child who cries and no one comes is dramatically altered. The child with a history of trauma or loss or abuse has no hope of healing without a nurturing relationship. In every way that I make time and space, that I give touch, eye contact, and I give words, I am going to empower this child to go back to the beginning of what he or she should have experienced in the arms of a loving parent that said, when you cry, I will come. The phenomenal thing about a trust-based intervention is, as we connect to this child, as we build safety, we actually change the brain chemistry. We change the wiring of the brain. This is really the heart and soul of all that we are and all that we do. Do I look into the child's eyes? Do I touch their arm when I talk to them? When they talk to me, do I stop what I'm doing and talk to them? This is the essence of mindfulness. The excitatory chemicals about I'm afraid, I'm hungry, I'm cold, but those are balanced when the caregiver comes and gives warmth. All regulation occurs first with an external regulator. So in the beginning, I regulate all. They're cold, I bring warmth. They're crying, I bring myself. And out of my regulation, their brain develops capacity for self-regulation. If this child didn't have this experience, that child doesn't feel safe. This chemistry can be altered. First, by knowing they're safe. Second, by nutrient-rich foods. Third, by my environmental regulation of that child's emotion. And fourth, by appropriate exercise. So we can balance brain chemistry by creating a holistic environment. We clearly have to deal with behavior. Correcting means showing a child the right behavior, praising him when he gets it, and showing it to him until he can get it right, and showing him with no fear and no shame, so that he builds success, not a greater sense of failure. So the message of hope for our families is
We don't want to stop there. Where's the message of hope? Come on now.
that we can help our children to dramatic levels of healing. We simply have to be devoted to it and be willing to invest what it's going to take.
So that is what TBRI is. And like I said, that video, actually, if you go to YouTube and even just look up Dr. Karen Purvis, TCU Child Development, her heart in all of her research was that everybody has access to what they learn. So you can find this video, lots of videos of her teaching. I just think she's brilliant. I have learned so much from her. So let's take a look at really the three kind of principles that she mentioned in that video. The first one is the connecting principles. And connecting principles, connecting principles address our attachment needs, right? So connecting principles address our attachment needs. So where in the world did we ever get this crazy idea that in order to help a child do better, that we need to make them feel worse? The truth is that we do better when we feel better. We do better when we feel better. So within these connecting principles that meet our attachment needs, the relationship is the focus. The relationship is the context for which growth can happen. The relationships are built on trust. So when we're working with a child who's experienced trauma, and again, that includes all sorts of things, including learning disabilities, that's definitely trauma. We're asking these kids to give up strategies that they have used before to get their needs met. And we're asking them to replace these old strategies that were not effective in getting their needs met in a healthy way with new strategies. And in order for them to do that, that requires trust. They are not going to give up their old ways of getting their needs met, even if they weren't effective ways, if they don't trust the relationship of the person who's asking them to do something new. So some really simple things that build trust, like she mentioned, are making eye contact with really soft, gentle eyes, getting down on their level. That really healthy touch, right? The high five or the fist bump or the hand on the shoulder, or something that Dr. Purvis taught me that I thought, well, that's simple. How come I never thought of that before? Is when I'm trying to get a child to look me in the eyes, and kids who've experienced trauma, kids that have disabilities, that can be a real struggle for them. So always being aware, like some kids, that's just not something they can do. But when you want to make some eye contact, just like really gently, I can't do it because it's backwards, like, cupping their chin with my hand really gently, not forcing it. Like sometimes I won't even touch their chin, but then if they're like trying to evade my eyes, I can actually direct their chin with my hand and get them to look me in the eyes. And it's such a gentle thing, instead of, no, look me in the eyes, I want to see your eyes, right? Which is oftentimes what we see happen, which is very disarming to them, or very arming to them, and we want to disarm fear, right? So just really soft eyes and eye contact. Kind of, you can build trust through just like mirroring opportunities, like, hey, we're both wearing black shirts today, or like, hey, I have glasses too, or hey, I really like that TV show as well. Those small connecting things build trust, and these things work whether the child is 3 or they're 18. They work across the board, right? Taking an interest in their lives, listening and paying attention to their body language. That's huge. Smiling, right? Smiling can just make a huge difference in terms of whether or not they trust you by smiling at them. Using their name when you speak to them. I always think about, this is actually something that we used to talk a lot about at the Boys and Girls Club. We used to say, of course, this was a number of years ago when Cheers was big, but you know how on Cheers, Norm would walk into the bar and everybody would yell, Norm, right? Because he was known there. That was his place. It was where he belonged and where he knew that he mattered, right? And we used to talk about the club that way too, that whenever a kid walked in the door, they were greeted by name. That was such an important piece of them feeling safe from the minute they walked in the door. And so one of our top priorities was knowing every kid by name and calling them by name the minute they walked in the door. So using a child's name, we all want to have our name spoken to us. Giving them a special job or a task to do, anything you can do to build some sort of connection. That kid who's driving you crazy, or that child who's having the worst day possible. Like, again, I was in middle school a couple times this week, but I was in another class where a kid I've had before, and he just, he's 13, right? And so he's trying to get attention and he's showing off and all this kind of stuff. And when I ask him, because I took the attendance and needed to send it down to the office, and you typically always give that job to that super trustworthy, really quiet, obedient kid. Like, I can trust them to go down to the office. And I turned to him and I said, "Hey," I said, "how about you take this down to the office for me today? Like, can you do it? I'm going to time you. I'm going to see how fast, because I know how long it should take you to get down there, but this is your job." And it was super funny because a couple of the other kids in the class goes, "No, that's not the guy you trust to do that. He might never come back to class." And I said, "Nope, I believe that he can do this. I believe," and I've had him in class a couple times, so we're building a rapport. I said, "I know this guy can do this and he's going to do it really well. This is going to be the day that he really shines." And his whole face just like lit up. His whole countenance changed to, "I'm going to kind of be a punk," to, "Oh, like she actually thinks that I have some value." And he took the attendance down. He came right back and he was a top-notch kid the rest of the time that I had him. And it was just this really simple, like, "Oh, she thinks that I matter. She thinks that I can do it. So I'm going to do it." Right. This kind of, this, if you believe that about me, then I believe that about myself. So other connecting principles are like using vocabulary that honors others, being very calm and direct and simple and fast forward, or in straightforward. Kids really appreciate that. Um, and practicing, and I love this idea of practicing language consistently during calm times, so that that same language will work during an emotional crisis. So just like, let's take some deep breaths, or like whatever it is, using those things, that those tools that you think might be helpful in a crisis when you're trying to help them regulate, using them in a calm environment first. So connecting principles address attachment needs. Empowering principles is the second one, and the empowering principles meet their physical needs. So stuff like managing sleep, hydration, blood sugar, some of those things we have control about as educators, and that type of thing. Some of them we don't. But making sure that kids are hydrated throughout the day. Dehydration has a huge impact on the capacity that our brain has to learn and to function and to grow. So staying hydrated, watching blood sugar, like having healthy snacks available, or working with parents in the school to make sure that that stuff is always available. If you can't meet those needs first, then trying to meet the other needs is not going to accomplish what you want it to accomplish. Getting regular physical activity, so getting kids up and moving. I gotta say that I really struggle with the idea that like you were bad in class and so I'm gonna make you stay in a recess with your head down. I think that those kids need to move their bodies. They probably need some fresh air. They need some sort of reset. I'm not sure how valuable it is just to make their bodies sit still. We actually process better when both sides of our bodies are moving, because what happens, like if I'm running or I'm walking or something that's utilizing both sides of my body, something called bilateral stimulation is happening, which helps move information from one side of the brain to the other. So that healthy processing of events, that healthy processing. So maybe that kid had a really horrible morning, right? And you have a little chat with them and say, go out to recess, and I want you to like run to the end of the field and back, and then decide that you're ready to come in, and we'll have a reset when you get back in. So just using their bodies as they're preparing for a reset can be a super helpful tool. So regular physical activity is really, really crucial. And then the idea of regulation that we already talked about. Some of these other things we'll talk about more tomorrow, so I'm going to save them. Okay, because I want to get through. And then transitions, rituals, and routines, which I'm sure as educators and parents, it is something you probably think about and talk about a lot. But kids that are in fight, flight, or freeze, kids that have experienced a lot of trauma, giving them, making sure they know about a transition before it comes can help you just avoid all sorts of problems, right? Avoid the emotional crisis, avoid the fear that leads into other things, having rituals and routines. Those things create felt safety. And that's the goal. When kids feel safe, they feel better, which means that they will do better. Um, and then the third one that we'll actually talk way more about next time, but the third principle of TBRI is the correcting principles. And correcting principles are the ones that are used to disarm the fear-based behaviors. So we're going to talk about behavior as a language next time, and how do we learn to interpret that language as our kids are speaking to us through their behavior. But the correcting principles are not used to be punitive. They're not used to shame. They're not used for that purpose at all. They're used to disarm fear-based behaviors. I have a need. I don't know how to get it met. This is the only tool that I have in my toolbox. This is the only strategy that I know. And I'm afraid that I'm not going to get my need met. So I'll do whatever I can. So we're going to talk way more about those things next week when we get into like, okay, so we know all these things. How do we actually create a culture that helps kids thrive and survive in my classroom or in my home or wherever it is. So that's kind of where I thought we'd stop here. All of this stuff, like if you want to look more into TBRI, and I really encourage you to do so, go to YouTube, just put that in to the search bar and you'll find some stuff. That whole flipping the lid thing, there's like tons of videos now, which I think is so cool. They're like how to talk to kids about it. I was in a classroom once where a teacher actually had like, where are you at today coming in? And she had like, this and this on her classroom wall, and the kids at any time could point to it as a way to communicate, like, my lid is flipped right now. Don't even ask me to do anything, which I think is really cool. So feel free to look up more information. I did not invent any of this stuff. This is just what I'm so thankful that the world has discovered and I have access to, and I just want to pass it on to others so that we can love the kids in our care well. These kids are a privilege to love and to care for, and to be one who, for however long in their lifetime, we are given access to their lives, to care for them, to speak their intrinsic value into. That is a gift that we have been given as educators and parents, and we want to steward that gift well and steward that privilege well. So at least I do, and I'm assuming you all do too, because you're here and you care about those types of things. So I'm going to stop there, and I don't know if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. If not, that's okay too.
Yeah, if you would just unmute yourself if you have a question to ask Rebecca, that would be great. I wish I had seen this last night because I was working with a student teacher and he had an issue and could have used some of this great advice to give him, because what we came up with wasn't so hot,
Which happens, right? Like we give ourselves grace upon grace. And
Yeah.
we do our best and we think through, man, you know what, next time I'm going to do that a little bit differently, or next time I'm going to try something differently. Thank goodness the brain can continue to be rewired.
Yeah, because sometimes you're not really aware of what you do to diffuse the situation.
Yeah.
I used to have a student that I would just read his body language and I could tell this is going to be a bad day or a good day. And if I knew it was going to be bad, I just shoo him back out in the hallway, get the class started, and then go to the student and say, okay, unload. And he would. And then he'd felt a lot better and came back in the class and everything was fine. But, if I didn't do that, the whole class would have been destroyed. So it's reading the body language of your kids really helps. And then
by doing that, by giving that kid that moment, right? By releasing the expectation of you just need to be ready to come in this room like everybody else, you released that expectation on him so that you could give him the moment he needed to feel seen and heard and valued. And when he received those things, it met that need in him and he was ready to go forward with his day, right?
Yeah.
You met that need. And sometimes we have to be willing to let go of our expectations for how everybody should act or everybody should respond, right? Sometimes we have to throw all the rules out the window for a particular child or two children or whatever, because they have needs that need to be met in a different way. And so that's part of our job, is to be listening and paying attention and being really creative, and hold things super loosely. Like, this is not working right now, or what's working for one child isn't working for another. Like, what do I do with that? Which can be really complicated if you're a teacher in a classroom with 30 kids.
Yeah.
That's not easy to do. And so what I love about these strategies and these principles, and even these hands-on things we'll talk about next time, is it doesn't matter if it's that kid that is really struggling and has some hard circumstances, or that child that comes from a pretty stable home life. These things work across the board for everybody. They meet all of our needs just as humans. And so I love that, because they can work in a whole classroom setting.
Yeah. So Deanne, do you have any questions or comments? If you're talking, you're muted. There we go.
I'm eating.
I know, my dinner is sitting right next to me.
No, but thank you. I was like, traumatic brain. I don't know if I don't know that I need this, but I'm glad I came. This has been very interesting. So thank you.
Welcome.
Right.
Thanks for coming.
I will be here again next week.
Great.
Yeah,
Like,
let's-
I'll just check in and see what it's about. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I think what I'm seeing is, I'm glad we taped these, because I'd really like to send it over to my student teacher school so that he can share it with the whole faculty. Because I think, what you've said here would help with a lot of the situations, like the boy that he was dealing with today. It came down to me I asked for permission to go sit and talk to the kid, and then found out what was really going on. And so I think if more teachers knew the little things they could do, like you said, the proximity, just standing next to them, or exercise. I had a kid with ADHD, and it was a private school. So I was able to let him go out my back door, run to the fence, come back, run back, sit down, and he was fine and I was fine. And nobody knew that he took off, because he sat right next to the back door by himself.
Oh my gosh, that's exactly, I was just, as you were talking about that, my older brother, it was before they diagnosed ADHD. He might have been, I don't know, but very, very hyperactive, could not sit still, stood at his desk all the time. And one of his teachers in first grade, it drove her crazy. And she was just angry at him all the time, right? She was just angry. And then he had this wonderful second grade teacher who had that same thought. She put him at the back of the classroom. So his desk was at the back of the classroom, and it was next to the door. And talk about like self-regulation. Like, he learned, they had just some like very quiet signal that he would flash her, she would nod or give the signal back or whatever. And he would just quietly, he never made a scene out of it, right? He would quietly exit out the back door. He would run a lap and then just come back into class and sit down.
Yeah.
And for another teacher might be like, I can't do that. They're losing instruction time. It's disruptive to the other kids. This teacher was like, you know what? That's actually way less disruptive to the rest of the class than me saying, sit down, sit down, sit down, whatever it
Right,
was.
right.
But she had to be willing to think outside the box. She had to be willing to let go of what might be the norm for how to treat a kid, but just realizing what he needs is to move his body. And if he's given the freedom to say, at this moment, I need to do that, then let him do that. So that idea of like that, moving again into that self-regulation. And we're not just talking about kids that are having huge emotional meltdowns. We're talking about little things like the ability to know, I need to move my body right now. And I'm going to learn how to ask for it when it's appropriate. I'm going to learn how to get that need met. My younger daughter had a pacifier. And she didn't need it so much for the comfort, but she just like, she reacts to the world very physically. And so she would bite. Like, I would be hugging her and she'd be laughing and stuff. She wasn't angry or anything. Her teeth would just like sink into me, biting so hard. And she would do the same thing with other kids. Like, she'd be playing really physical with little kids as a toddler and bite them really hard. And I kept saying, but she's not even mad. Like, she's not being mean there's nothing mean spirited about this at all. So we let her keep her pacifier for a long time because she could just chew on it. And she was 2 years old in the nursery at church and had bit a couple kids. Just out of love, whatever. And we worked with her. She was incredibly verbal as a toddler to be able, she would have in the diaper bag that was hung outside the classroom, her binky. And as a 2-year-old, she learned how to go to the teacher and say, I need to chew on my binky. Can I go get it? And so she would get her binky. She would just chomp, chomp, chomp for a few minutes, put it back, and then go back into the class. So, even something as simple as that, like that is regulation. I have a need, I can identify it, and I can get that need met in a really healthy way. But just thinking outside the box, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love that. Well, it looks like time is up. I don't want to take people's time.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Rebecca, and I look forward to next week.